And also, you know, when you get up to your D&D levels or your vampire levels, they know what should be on the cover because they know what sells better than I do, right? I mean, I was never going to second guess a White Wolf cover because White Wolf knows what their covers look like. They know what's going to get the, you know, the kids to come out and buy more White Wolf books. They know it better than I do. They have way more data than I have.
And release.
Yes, right. So the so in that terms, but if you can, I think that if you have a design, if you are a designer, and you're looking at building a setting and you're trying to create a feel, the more input you have on the more different parts of publication, the better. When I did the Star Trek game, I was the line developer for the original series game from Last Unicorn, and I wrote my part. I edited everyone else's part. I picked the fonts. Christian Moore, who was the publisher, went to Paramount and found production stills that had not seen the light of day since 1968. And he got them digitized and brought them back in, and we color corrected the stills by hand because they hadn't been touched.
Yeah.
And so we were doing that. I did the maps. My credits are all over that like a rash because I really thought that the whole book should look the way the book should look. And our book designer did a really great job, and all I told him was make it look like it fell out of a desktop publishing machine in 1968. And he says, "You got it." And sure enough, it did. So there's a degree to which you can be, but I think if you've got a vision for a product, for a property, for a product, you should, you know, use every option that you have to get that out there. And certainly if you're a game master, you know, make sure that everything you do at the table conforms to the vision of the feel that you want at your table. If you're like, oh, I love everything about this game, but the mass combat rules don't really, you know, feed my theme here of single heroes, well, don't use the mass combat rules, or use a different set of mass combat rules that you like better, or make your own mass combat rules, although that way lies madness. But, you know, you're creating an artistic moment, right? It's the jazz combo doesn't add a kettle drum to everything just because they have a kettle drum in the room, right? If the song's got a kettle drum in it, then they play it. If they don't, then they don't play it. Similarly, if just because there's a saxophone rule in the back of the book doesn't mean you have to use saxophones. The same thing. Anybody got another one?
I'd love to hear some advice about how you add depth to a campaign as a GM, because I've listened to your podcast and read your articles for yours, so I know you have a wealth of knowledge. But when I hear you talk about some of your Unknown Armies campaigns or whatever, I always wonder, how do you work in all the extra little touches into a game, like without railroading your characters or your players too much? How do you make sure they kind of uncover things, or not just that, but how do you let those things be there for them to see without just becoming too obsessed?
Well, I mean, too obsessed is like, you know, too much garlic. It's, you know, you're just as obsessed as you'd like. I'm not going to tell you you're too obsessed. I would say that the way to get players to discover things, there's two ways. There's, you know, the carrot and the stick, right? You either look for things that the player already wants to find or the character wants to find, and the character, you should know what they want to find because you can read their character sheet. You can listen to the player when they're saying, my character wants to find his lost sister, or my character wants to master the 5th level of fire magic, or whatever it is that my character wants. You know what will motivate them, what will bring them to a thing. Similarly, the stick is not beat on them until they look under the helmet. The stick is to have the bad guys start hunting for the helmet and say, we're going to go find the helmet. We're going to find the helmet, and when we lift it, there's going to be something under there so awesome that we'll be able to rule the world with it, or we'll be able to kill your sister and prevent you from learning fire magic with it. And so the stick is not, you go this way. The stick is, well, if you don't go this way, you're never going to get to go that way because the bad guys will have already gotten that way. And leave that up to the players. And maybe the players will say, they're not that bad, or helmet schmelmet. That's just something you've got to, you know, suck up and deal with, because the opposite, in which you're putting the players in a trench and making them walk along the bottom of it, is no fun for anyone. And again, if that's what they wanted to play, is walk straight in a trench, that's what video games are for. That's what they can do. They can have a much deeper, better decorated trench with more real-time FPSs in it than we can. So we can't be playing trench games anymore. That was great back in 1980 when the only competition was extra Pong, as opposed to regular Pong. but and Zork. But now the competition is much better. So we have to present worlds that respond to player choice, and whether that's the player choice of when they wrote down their character sheet, they decided what is their character interested in, and you have something that you've uncovered in your obsessive or not too obsessive study of the past that you think can be made to work. And even if it can't, maybe it has nothing to do with fire magic. Maybe you are the world's biggest fan of Lafayette, and you're like, I'm pretty sure Lafayette never studied fire magic, was never interested in fire magic, whatever. So what you do is you want them to know all about Lafayette. They're into fire magic. How do I solve this problem? Well, you then present someone that Lafayette is friends with, has to deal with, that is into fire magic. Or you have Lafayette's house is burned down by a fire magician, and now he's mad at the fire magicians, and he wants to go hunt them all down. But however that is, you can bring Lafayette into the game, and then the fire magician guy starts saying, man, the Marquis de Lafayette is mad as hell at me. I wonder what I did. And they will start finding things out, and then you can bring other stuff in. And just as a side note, if you've got a biography of Lafayette that's over, say, 300 pages, I'll bet there's something in there you can make, oh, look, he was into fire magic. That explains everything. Because that always happens. Everyone's life is weird and confusing and full of little strange bits that don't get explained easily. So, it's not that hard. But you can, it does run the risk of being too obsessed, though, as you say. But if you are already that obsessed with something, you should be able to say, all right, maybe not fire magic, but what about Lafayette is going to fit with one of my characters? What's the thing that they're going to be interested in? Are they going to be interested in the fact that he's got George Washington's shoe buckles? Are they going to be interested in the fact that he has one of the original copies of the Declaration of Independence? Are they going to be interested in the fact that, something about his servants or his family or his house? What's going to draw them already? And then you plant knowledge that Lafayette is relevant in the hand of that player character. You either just plant it normally, they've succeeded a research roll, or you have, Thursby dies and falls across the thing holding the black bird that provides them with the, oh, now I have to go hunt down everything about Lafayette. And you're like, oh, darn it. That's how you bring it to their attention. And then there's a game called Weapons of the Gods by Arshon Borgstrom that does this better than any other game that I've ever seen, and it actually monetizes the setting. So as a character element, and you can do this at home with your own game, as a character element, as an advantage that they bought at character creation, they may have taken Terracotta Warriors. So what that means is they have a page, page and a half, 2 pages, that's all they have to read about Terracotta Warriors. So they are now as interested in Terracotta Warriors as you are. But because they bought that, they get like a +1 in answering questions about Terracotta Warriors, they get a +1 in fighting Terracotta Warriors, and they have a guarantee from the GM that at some point they will stumble across a cave full of Terracotta Warriors. And that's what you bought with your character points. And by making you spend those character points to earn pieces of the setting, Borgstrom creates that hook, that demand on the part of the player, because once you've bought something, you're going to get use out of it. And you can do that same thing in your game. You can have some number of elements that each, they provide bonuses to knowledge at a certain level, or after a certain amount of expertise, they provide a bonus to combat. And you guarantee that they will have this encounter, with a good reaction bonus, or that they'll just have this encounter, depending. And that's something that they bought, right? Mm-hmm. And you can sell those if that's something that you're trying to build into your backstory, or you can just keep that in mind mechanically, and you can issue that on an ad hoc basis. You say, oh, you've been looking into Lafayette so well, but just take a point in history and know that whenever you're looking into Lafayette, you get another +1, because you're like the world's expert on Lafayette now, or whatever it is. You just give it as a free little bonus to the experience, and then they're going to say, well, like they say, if the only thing you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. If the only thing you have is a screwdriver of Lafayette solving, you're going to be looking for places to stick your screwdriver. And that is what you're going to be able to provide them in the course of the game. I sort of underemphasize the stick, but the stick is, the larger takeaway from that is that the villains, the bad guys, the op 4 should always have their own agenda. Their agenda is not to react to the players. They would rather the players leave. Their agenda is to do whatever, to find the Holy Grail and use it for evil, to master glacier magic, to whatever it is. That's their agenda. They want to conquer the land. They want to kill the princess. They have their own agenda. The player agenda should just be irrelevant. The player's job then is to proactively interfere with the bad guy agenda. And once they make themselves annoying enough, then the bad guy has sub-item B on my agenda, kill that guy, because he's an annoying jerk. But that's what drives the story. The story should not be wait around at the train station and hope a train comes along going somewhere exciting. The agenda should be, we've got places to go and people to see, and while we're finding things that we already want to find from our character viewpoint, we're stumbling across these bad guys that are doing bad guy things. And because we are wandering broadsword-wielding murder hobos, we feel that bad guys should be stopped. Problem solved. And if they don't feel the bad guys should be stopped, send the bad guys after the same things they want, and pretty soon they'll feel that they should be stopped.
Which makes the player characters the opt-for, actually.
Yeah, well,
the bad guys just wanted what they wanted. We were the ones who got in their way.
There is a moment in many games that I run where my player characters say, we have enough data about the world, let's see if we can figure out who the actual player character heroes are.
Right.
Which faction is actually the good guys? Because we're not it.
I have a question. I thought I was going to ask you about game development, but it turns out it's a GM question. Maybe I'll ask about that later. But building on that, what we were talking about just now, you're very methodical about how you approach your world building. How do you approach your antagonists? Obviously they're going to have their own agenda.
Mm-hmm.
You've made that clear. But how do you make them compelling characters that the players really, really hate, or really feel motivated to challenge?
I think that when you're building a villain, there's two ways that you're going to get the players to hate them. There's sort of the mechanical, gamey way, the resource shortage way. There's only 2 megaliths of power in the whole valley, and they control one and you control the other. You're already going to have something. And then they take yours away at night when you're not paying attention. Now you're really mad at them. And that's just area denial. And that can happen whether the area is an area of expertise, social, credit, whatever. They've got something, you want that thing. You've got something, they want that thing. That's very mechanical and very easy to do. And a lot of players, in the great tradition of, you turn on, soapbox derby racing on ESPN 12 in the middle of the night, and it's Burma versus Thailand, and within 2 minutes, I guarantee you everyone in this room is rooting for either Burma or Thailand. Right? None of us are soapbox derby racing fans. None of us care about Southeast Asia. We're like, oh, I hate that red guy, such a jerk. And in 5 minutes you're agreeing with color commentators. Yeah, he does do that all the time. I hate that guy. That is a natural consequence of, I think, it's certainly a consequence of being male, and I presume it's a consequence also of being human. But picking a side and hating the other one is very standard. And it's easy to develop just on sort of a resource denial thing. And plenty of game groups will follow along with you and get all the love that they want. The other way to do it, though, is to come across a way and think of a way to role play the villain, to present the villain's viewpoint in a way that is not sympathetic, because sympathetic is not necessarily the killer. The way to get player buy-in is to make sure that the viewpoint is something that they can recognize exists for another reason than just to screw them. Right? That will add a second dimension. They already know the villain wants to screw them because they want that megalith. Now they have to know something else about that villain, and that might just be that the villain is a Nazi, and you're like, well, we hate Nazis, we hate this guy, that problem is solved. Or it might just be that villain is an orc, we hate orcs, we hate this guy, that problem is solved. But it might also be that that villain has a great religious commitment to megalith unity, and you don't. Or you didn't before, and now you do, but you have the other one. But there's something that that villain wants that is separate from, different from, aside from, that something is driving them. And it doesn't have to be oh, I'm trying to get my wife out of purgatory, or I'm doing it because I have misunderstood by my parents and I'm reacting against them. Don't do that. Give them something that is in the world that the players can recognize, can bounce off of, can respond to. Like, if the villain's a Nazi, you say, well, I hate Nazis, I think they're bad, I think they should all die. That's something we're recognizing and responding to. If he says, I'm getting that megalith because I believe in the religion of Megalith unity. They can say, do I believe in that religion? Do I know of that religion? Is my cleric of that religion? If I've got a cleric, does he hate that religion? You tell me, how do I build on that? And sometimes it's just the way you play them will make the characters want to punch them in the face, right? I mean, that might just be a matter of doing the accent or being a real arrogant jerk when you role-play the villain. And they're like, yeah, I'm going to push his teeth down his stupid throat for saying that thing about my mom or just for being him. And that will also help. And a lot of that is just, what are you strong at the table? If you're strong at silly accents, you do the villain with a silly accent that gives them a sense of his ethnicity, or not his ethnicity, but his, you do your his background, his Nazi voice or his Deep One voice or whatever kind of voice it is, or his character in a way that you can, if he sort of has a quaver in his throat, he's sort of got that old necromancer cough. You're like, oh yeah, he's 700 years old. That's why he's so creepy and weird. That's why we can go after him. Or it might just be a element of his sort of outside persona that maybe wherever his actions happen, there are rats. People generally don't like rats. No one is usually on a crusade against rats, but if whenever he does something, there's like a cloud of rats or a horde of rats or people's horses that the hair drops off their tail and becomes pale and rat-like, that's sort of a stigmata that he produces, a footprint, a spoor. A, they can use that to track him, which is always helpful, and B, it can become a way of signifying the villain's presence without putting the villain on stage to be shot at. So you can have a lot of element can go through. If you just pick one or two color elements that villain brings with them that are the evidence of their presence. I should have recognized your stench the moment I was brought on board, Vader. If you can have your players metaphorically recognize your villain's stench the moment they're brought on board, that will go a long way to getting them to hating that guy, tracking down his stench, and trying to figure out what is going on. Was he dead? Why does he smell like that? What's the story behind this? Getting them to ask other questions about the villain besides how do we get the megalith back goes a long way to deepening him, because they're providing meaning themselves. And, to the extent, I mean, again, if you're starting with Earth and your villain is Stalin, you've got all the background you want, right? You can just keep bringing Stalin stuff on all the time, and then you can play off the old Romanian joke when they would walk past the Ceausescu's palace. Romanians would turn up their collar and do this because vampires have no body heat, right? And so their joke was that it was always cold around the palace, even though it wasn't actually. But by doing that, they would sort of send a signal that the Ceausescus are dead, and that's why it's so cold around here. And so, again, your villain may not have a magical stench, but there's going to be something that people do as a result of their presence, as a result of their actions. I mean, even if it's just normal Stalin, the fact that they can't take a meeting with anyone without going out to the park where no one can surveil them, right? Or, just everyone who talks to them is always looking over their shoulders. That tells you something about that villain, what that villain has done to the world. And so that can be a good way to present that villain's qualities. Yeah.
I mean, just walked in. It looks like we're in the question and answer period.
Yeah, we are.
I had a question. Cthulhu 7th is coming up. And
Yeah.
you have made your opinions known. Some of the stuff does not appear to look like it's going to work out to you.
Mm-hmm.
I am being hopeful.
I think hope is a great virtue, and I would never try to talk you out of it.
I was wondering, having run Massive General Thotep, having these two schmucks let me do just about everything to them and a whole bunch of other people, has there been anything that you think hasn't been tried using either the Lovecraft mythos or maybe even going over to Dunsany or Machen? Is there anything which would be right for something new to be doing with Call of Cthulhu?
Well, I mean, to an extent, when I think of it, I write it. So, I mean, Bookhounds of London was something no one had ever done.
Yeah.
And I did it. There are a number of things that I have, in the pipe that are going to be things that haven't been done or that have been done very, very rarely in disposable one-shots in moments that aren't part of it. Robin doing the Surrealists reforming the Dreamlands was a new thing. I think there's always something new. I think our creativity is such, or should be such, that we should always be capable of thinking of something new, if only it is the, gosh, Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. is a real cat's breakfast. Maybe if I could do it in a Lovecraft universe, it would be better. Or, gosh, I really love Babylon 5. What's that like if I turn up the Cthulhu quality of that to 11, instead of just keeping it down around 2.5 the way that JMS had it, right? So you can always, and the great thing about the mythos is that it is universal. It transcends space and time. It's like Doctor Who. It can show up anywhere. So
Even Doctor Who.
anything in Doctor Who, for example, and indeed it has. You can you can take the mythos to anything you already like and mythos it. You can take anything you already like and put it into the mythos, or you can sort of dig down into the sort of central concerns of the mythos, or at least of Cthulhu role-playing, and ask, what if I change one of those? What if I switch that around? So, you know, I mean, yeah, I probably have tons of new things that can be done with the Cthulhu mythos, and every time I think of them, I do one, and then ideally it gets published. Right now, I want to do, in the Hounds series, I'm trying to sell Simon on Bloodhounds of Moscow, where you play members of probably the Interior Ministry police who are tasked with, you know, finding solutions to crimes and mysteries in Moscow. And since virtually all of them are caused by Stalin, you can't look too deeply at them. But
He doesn't know about it.
but some of them are caused by the mythos. And now it's like, oh man, now what do I do? Because if I call in the NKVD, what if they get a hold of the Necronomicon? That's probably not good. But if I go around and don't call the NKVD, I'm going to go to Siberia, and that's really not good. Oh, this is terrible. And so I think that a mythos world in which you also can't trust humanity is something that is an interesting choice. So yeah, I mean, I think there's lots of possibilities that you can do with the mythos. It's not just literature, which Lovecraft is, but it's a philosophical concept. It's a philosophical structure, and a litany of bad guys. And you should be able to tell stories through a philosophical structure and against a litany of bad guys in virtually any sort of storytelling that you want to make. So I would say, the only limit is your creativity and free time in terms of coming up with new rings to change on the mythos. Although that said, there's nothing wrong with a good old haunted house, nothing wrong with a good old inbred town full of weirdos who worship Yog-Sothoth. I mean, one of the reasons that we enjoy playing cliches more than we enjoy watching cliches is that a cliche from the inside looks like a familiar point, right? It doesn't look like, oh God, the same thing over and over again. I mean, it can be. If you run 10 haunted houses, that 10th is actually going to get a little samey. But if you run 3 haunted houses and you've spaced them out, you put them into a haunted house, they're like, oh, I have recognizable buy-in. I don't know if you came in at the beginning, but I was talking about that being a fundamental, get people to step through the door. They recognize the challenges, they recognize the problems, and then the parts that you've added that are new and interesting will stand out in more relief, right? It's like, oh, this is a much more interesting cannibal cult than the other cannibal cult, because what you've done is you've not just had them eat dead people and eat a few live people, they're also gaining their skills and they're gaining their powers because they've got the Trebriand Island cannibal magics where you eat someone, or the Dyak cannibal magics where you eat someone and gain their virtue, right? They gain their mana. And so now these ghouls have been, oh no, that was the graveyard where all those sharpshooting instructors from the army were buried. That's probably not going to have a good result at all for us. And then the question is, I'm dying, only I can, decipher the thing and shut up the ghoul gate. But if you eat my arms and brain, maybe you can. It's like, oh, I don't want to eat my friends to stop. But what if I have to? What if that's really the only way to keep Mordigian from crawling out and devouring St. Louis?
And who hasn't asked that question?
Well, it's just St. Louis.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's St. Louis, so obviously that's why it's a moral dilemma.
Right. Mordigian, St. Louis, it can pass. Is it maybe New York? Then it's a problem.
Yeah, now we have issues. So I think that there's plenty of things that you can do, and you take the familiar things and you say, all right, what is familiar and tiresome about a haunted house? We want to do that one because that's the fun part for me, the doors and the blood and the good. Oh, but the ghost is something that I don't like. I don't like there having to be a ghost. What can I have instead of a ghost? Can I have an etheric shadow? Can I have a future hallucination, that it's not a ghost from the past, it's an atrocity that will happen in the future that's echoing back? How do I stop that? How do I shut that door? I mean, maybe that's the question that you're asking. So you can always play change-up on this stuff. I mean, to some extent, we've been playing change-up on the same basic mythography since, Epic of Gilgamesh and the Odyssey and maybe Chaucer. You know, I think if you look if you look for the last original thing that was done in literature or in culture, you're gonna be going a lot earlier than you think you are, maybe. Anybody else? Bueller?
I did have one other
Yeah,
question.
sure.
I mentioned earlier, I just want to give other people a chance to
No,
ask theirs.
absolutely.
One of the things you'd mentioned was, Trek.
Mhm.
And as at least 2 or 3 people in this room know, that's been my primary storytelling passion since about the mid-90s. And I think it was either, I know it was back in 02 or 03, it was either Steve Long or S. John Ross that I asked a similar question to. And they specifically included the other one, that's why I can't remember which one I asked, and you in their answer. And said, between the 3 of us, we have probably spent more time thinking about Trek's story than the entire writing cast of Paramount.
Oh, absolutely, at that time.
But even now, one of the things that has always struck me is, especially with a game like Star Trek, where the episodes were just that, episodic, and we all joke about continuity in Star Trek, because that's, military intelligence or jumbo shrimp. Continuity in Star Trek simply doesn't exist. But as a game designer and as a GM, you are held. Your players are your biggest critics, and they're going to hold you to a level of continuity that only the most mocked stereotype of fans, the comic book guy on The Simpsons, writers at Paramount, to the same degree of punctiliousness and exactitude with every period and comma that your players will hold you at a gaming table.
So what's the question?
How does that, I guess when you're writing a game based on a property like that, how do you have to bear in mind the notion that at a gaming table there is going to be more of a need for certitude and less flexibility in the universe than a writer of the TV property on which it is based, and the feel of which gets someone in the door than those writers?
Well, I mean, all right, there's sort of 2 or 3 possible answers to that, and I might as well answer them all. One is the previous discussion. If you've got a guy who only in your Star Trek table to pick nits, don't play a role-playing game with that guy because he's going to be bad at it.
So just discuss Star Trek instead.
Yeah, just
don't
to talk Star Trek with that guy. Play, something either he doesn't pick nits about or don't play games with him if he can't control that nerd editor subroutine. Right? I mean, I've got the nerd editor subroutine in spades, but I don't take it to the gaming table if I'm a player. I have to take it if I'm the GM because I'm in charge of, like you say, maintaining continuity. And I try not to take it with me to, things that I want to enjoy on a less than nerd editor subroutine level, which is increasingly most things. But that's sort of a cheap answer to your question. There's a couple of other, and when we were writing the games, we had to retroactively create continuity where none existed. The saving grace was that with Star Trek, the 4 Star Wars guys, God forbid their lives, but we only had to pay attention to what was filmed. If it was in the TV show or in the movies, it counted. Even the animated series didn't count. The novels, none of them counted. So we only had a very limited universe to make sense out of. And even then, we would write things, and Paramount would say, "Oh, you can't have that." And it's like, you had that. When we were mentioning General Order 34 or 24 in the Star Trek game, and Paramount's like, "You can't have Captain Kirk ordering to commit genocide on a planet." It's like, you had Captain Kirk ordering. I just put it in my game, and it's, well, you have to change it now because it isn't true. So I came up with a backstory that General Order 24, General Order 24, and everyone was happy. So a lot of it is just when you're doing a licensed property, what the licensors want now trumps what the licensors wanted in 1967. And that's just, a sort of an inside baseball professional answer to your question, is you have to know all the material, and it's like an iceberg or a diamond. You cut off the parts that are going to look ugly, and you leave the parts that are going to look shiny, and you hold those parts toward the audience, and the back part sticks away underwater, right, in the ring. So that's the basic result also at the table. If you are running a game of Star Trek for your players, and everyone knows that there are 2 different possible, let's take the Klingons. There's 2 different possible Klingons. There's proper old series Klingons with their Fu Manchu mustaches and the shoe polish foreheads. And there's bumpy forehead Klingons who are sort of, cut-right samurai. And it's like, okay, which Klingons are we using? You as the GM must provide. It doesn't matter which one you choose. You're going to choose the one that's going to work best at your table. But you have to provide you have to keep the fun things about the Klingons you chose pointed towards the players, so that they don't have incentive to go around and look at the ugly part. So if they really like the bumpy head cut-right samurai Klingon, you have to foreground honor and family tradition and his glory is not the glory of the Empire, and lots of that. That has to be always there. Anytime you meet Klingons, they have to be banging on, gassing on about that forever. Because if the first time you meet a Klingon is he says, this reminds me of our old duels against Captain Kirk. When we had shiny armor and we basically were the treacherous scumbags of the universe. Gosh, what fun we had then. Then the players will take that as license to say, hey, yeah, what is that? And also, what happened to your heads? And all those questions start coming up. But again, that works once in one show. That doesn't work at the table. Well, we're going to put him in the neuroanalyzer chair and make him talk about it. We're going to look on the Star Trek or on the Starfleet database and find out, whatever. And if you're playing the old school Klingons, then you have to emphasize their sort of sneaky Cold War Russian bad guy ways and not honor and my family would not approve, because those aren't those Klingons. And so you keep that pointed towards them, and then they may never go around the back and say, do you guys have honor and magic swords? It's like, why would we do that? We have a disruptor pistol.
Spaceships, have you heard of them?
Hello, not medieval. You must be thinking of medieval planet. So when you're presenting something like that has different interpretations or different backstories, you focus on the ones that you think the game is going to be out, or the ones that you think you really have energy with, the players have energy with. Right. You keep that pointed towards them.
Thank you, fans, for joining us for another episode of The Nerdstravaganza. If you'd like more Ganza goodness, why not subscribe to our channel? Visit our homepage, follow us on Twitter, and like us on Facebook.